Schindler through right. So is it recording? It's recording. So there was a comment made that I really like Japanese architecture, the open and closedness, the linkage to nature. And one of the things to understand is that Frank Lloyd Wright visited Japan in his youth, and then again worked in Japan later, and was, whether he talked about it a lot or not, he was heavily influenced by Japanese culture and Japanese building. So part of what occurred when you start to look at Japanese influence on Wright, and then Wright's influence on movements like De Stijl in the Dutch De Stijl movement, or you look at even German architecture of the Bauhaus and the lack of symmetry. All right, because when you think about most of the classical buildings that we've been studying to date, you guys think about, you know, these symmetrical buildings, right? But in Japan, the notion of asymmetry is more closely linked to nature and allows more flexibility to kind of blend in with nature, to work around geographic features and land features. So the influence of Japan on Wright, and then Wright's influence on many subsequent architecture and art movements, is part of what got us to what you might find as enjoyable, what you might like. So, all right, so continuing on. Click here. So one of the buildings that we could probably look at as a case study, as a matter of fact, I don't know if you recognize it, but that building that's back here in the corner, see this one right here? A picture that I showed you earlier was taken right of that corner in that courtyard. Okay, the one where we were looking at the stone and the post and the infill panel. That was from that corner. But the Katsura Villa in Kyoto is one of these buildings that architects study. Okay, so what I thought would be interesting would be to compare the Villa Katsutra, and other people have done the same comparison, which is the Japanese villa, okay, to the Villa Rotunda, which you guys will study when you get into Renaissance architecture. But the Villa Rotunda is, you know, one of the most heavily studied sort of Western classical buildings around. And so looking at just the plan view of things, right, you look at the Villa Katsura and you see this sort of flowing building, right, sort of opening up and adjusting itself to the landscape. There is this lack of symmetry in the overall composition, right? When you look at this, you see the posts, you see the little dotted lines. Those are the edges of the tatami mats. You can see that the whole thing is sort of planned out as a tatami grid, okay? But you can't get away from this sort of lack of perfect symmetry. When you look at the Villa Rotunda, you get the opposite. You get this idea that there's this central place, right, that man occupies. And from that place, that man could survey east, west, north, and south and see the world as his. Very, very different than the Villa Katsutra, where you're everywhere that you look out, you're sort of engaging nature. You're not standing as a singular element looking out at everything you own. You're standing inside of nature, sort of surrounded by it and enjoying it in a different fashion. Okay, so taking another look at a comparison of aerial views of Katsutra and the Villa Rotunda, and I've noticed that I've not capitalized the word villa twice. So the Villa Rotunda sits up on a hilltop, right? The intent of the Villa Rotunda is that it is this iconic object at the top of the hill, all right, and that it looks out over all of the landscape around it. The Villa Katsutra sits next to a lake, inside of a forest, and it sort of blends into the forest. So one of those is intended to be viewed as a singular object. The other one is intended to be viewed as part of the landscape. right? That whole same notion had a heavy influence on Frank Lloyd Wright. If you look at the way that Wright cites his buildings, you'll see that there is this integration of the building to nature that doesn't exist in other works of that period. We could, for example, compare the Villa Savoie to Taliesin West, right? So those are two buildings. Not Taliesin West, Taliesin East. Taliesin East was Frank Lloyd Wright's sort of office and school, okay? East coast of the United States. The Villa Savoie was a probably relatively contemporary building by Le Corbusier in France. Frank Lloyd Wright's, like the Villa Quatre, sort of is this sprawling set of forms that are set into a forested hillside. The Villa Savoie sits in a cleared open meadow. It is a perfect white sort of box with black columns. It sits in stark contrast to its environment. It doesn't blend with it. It's an object in the center. Okay, so I got 2 minutes. So let's take a look at some of the major sort of religions of Japan, the traditions. So we have Shintoism, which we've already talked about, and Buddhism. So Shintoism was an ethnic religion, okay? Think of it more as less organized and more sort of homegrown, whereas Buddhism was a much more organized sort of religion. Buddhism became a powerful religion. So the monks and priests of Buddhism, as the religion grew, gained power and money. Shintoism was associated with nobility in Japan, but it had a much sort of more homegrown, low-key sort of influence. All right. Both of those movements sort of influenced architecture. So Shinto architecture, when we think about Shinto, we think about mostly small shrines, maybe small building complexes. And much of the time, the idea in Shintoism is that there was something in nature that was considered to have profound spiritual power. Okay, that there was a strong spirit in it. And so a lot of times when you look at Shinto shrines, the Shinto shrines might be, you know, a thing in nature, a tree, a rock. Sometimes the tree and the rock might have a shrine, a man-made shrine next to it. In other cases, the shrine might be something that is carried and has a sacred element inside of it. Okay? Here's an example of a place that was considered to have this sort of powerful meaning, the wedded rocks. And essentially the way that they sort of made these things institutionalized was that they would use things like rope, right, to kind of put it around to kind of demark it. In this particular case, they used rope to show that the rocks are kind of in relation to each other, that they're wedded. Another element that you see at the top, I'll learn to stop this thing. All right, stop. Is this torii. And so the torii was this sort of spiritual gate, okay? And it was one of the sort of common symbols of Shintoism, and it was also adopted into sort of Buddhist architecture. I think I'm going to, well, I'll go one more. All right. Here is the torii that is out in the water in the bay at Itsukushima. So there's a large shrine in the background that has more of a Buddhist influence, okay? And then there's the torii that's out in the front. Now, more than likely, the placement of the sort of complex of buildings is related to the special character of the natural setting at that particular location, okay? I think I'm going to stop this there so I don't get too long.